Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Layak Siddiqui, the father of Holophase, a seasoned weaver and even an old, patient spider regularly looks back at what has already been woven. In that act of looking back, they do two things at once. They check the work for errors, and they discover the next direction the weaving must take. In the same spirit, we too must look back at the long journey we have traveled, from episode 1 to episode 13a, a journey through the infinite holophase pattern fields, into regions no mind has ever mapped. Now we pause, and we look back across everything we have built, so we can compress it into one coherent, breathtaking picture of holophase. There is a reason this journey could not begin with equations. There is a reason it could not begin with particles, fields, space-time, energy, or laws. And there is a reason it could not even begin with the word universe, because each of those words already assumes something deeper. That reality is readable, that differences can be detected, that patterns can be shared, and that knowledge can exist publicly, not only privately inside a single mind. From the beginning, Holophase did not try to win by sounding clever. It tried to win by refusing to cheat. We chose the most uncomfortable starting point on purpose, the point where you can no longer hide inside inherited concepts. Episode 1 began with restraint. Not what is real, but what must already be true before the question, what is real, can be asked in a way that can be checked by anyone else. Before particles, there must be comparability. Before laws, there must be a way to tell whether two situations can be said to be the same or different in a shareable way. Before any measurement, there must be a permission for distinction. So we introduced phi as a candidate root, not a substance, not a mystical essence, not a hidden object sitting behind the world. A candidate root is held to one standard only. What can it generate without smuggling anything else? Phi was proposed as a continuous cyclic order, a single primitive capable of being compared, repeated, and differentiated. The listener was not asked to believe Phi. The listener was asked to hold it accountable. If it cannot be made operational, if it cannot be made falsifiable, it must be rejected. From the first minute, the program was designed to be able to fail cleanly. Episode 2 then applied pressure to the most comfortable modern slogan: everything is energy. That slogan feels final because it sounds quantitative. But comfort is not truth. Energy is already downstream. Energy presupposes time, change, a system boundary, a measurement window, and a bookkeeping convention. Energy is not what reality is. It is how reality is counted once a comparison protocol exists. That demotion matters because it shows the entire inherited ontology is built from measurement reports, not from primitives. Once you see this, the foundation must move. You cannot begin from the tally and pretend you have begun from the thing itself. Episode 3 made the first constructive move. If phi is the root, then its changes must be the first readable words. In other programs, calculus is treated as human math. Here, it became a way of asking questions that reality itself answers. Change was no longer a side effect. Change became the alphabet. But the surprise was deeper than differentiation itself. When you take the first derivative seriously, time, space, and motion stop behaving like separate containers. They begin to appear as inseparable readouts of one organized variation. Cadence, texture, and transport braided together. You do not begin with time and then watch things move. You infer time from the repeatability of change. You do not begin with space and then place objects inside it. You infer space from relational structure in variation. You do not begin with motion as a primitive. You infer motion from how cadence and texture cohere across a window. Episode 4 extended that discipline into a hierarchy. Not just first change, but change of change, and change of change of change. The derivative tower arrived, and with it, a new way to see what people used to call forces. We did not deny forces, we reinterpreted them. They are not independent substances pushing from the outside. They are signatures of higher order structure in the same root field. This matters because it transforms laws from commandments into consistency conditions. Statements that survive because the structure cannot remain coherent without them. The world does not obey laws the way a citizen obeys a king. The world exhibits constraints the way a woven fabric exhibits tension patterns when you pull on it. Episode 5. Re-earn the oldest containers. Time, space, motion. We did not throw them away. We stopped worshipping them. We learned to treat them as readouts, not foundations. That shift turned centuries of metaphysical debate into a technical question. What features of Phi's derivative organization produce the experience of time, the texture of space, and the coherence of motion? The listener was not asked to accept dimensions as given. The listener was invited to watch dimensions arise as bookkeeping for structure, as the coordinate language of what Phi is doing, not as a pre-installed stage in which Phi happens to live. Then came the literacy arc, from episode 6 through episode 10, where we built what we now have to say out loud in a sharper way. We built the Holophase language. Episode 6 introduced the crucial idea that reality is not a code to memorize, but a language to speak. A code is finite. You can list it and be done. A language is generative. It can produce endlessly many sentences by combining a small vocabulary with strict grammar. The derivative hierarchy became a tree. An infinite vocabulary in principle, because you can always ask finer questions, and a finite practice in reality, because we are finite beings with finite windows and finite coherence. Episode 7 pushed that literacy into identity. An object is not a label stuck onto a region. An object is a persistence pattern in the derivative vocabulary. Identity becomes a stable fingerprint, a structure that remains invariant across permissible redescriptions and across repeated windows. Episode 7 also made meaning operational. Meaning is predictive compression. A pattern has meaning if it lets you say less while predicting more, across repeated windows, while carrying an explicit route to failure. This was a deliberate shock to the listener's intuition, because it replaces romantic meaning with a measurable discipline. But it also protects meaning from collapse, because it ties meaning to public performance rather than private feeling. Episode 8 stripped the language of implementation bias. No coordinate worship. No instrument worship. No hidden absolutes. We learned to care about equivalence. Two descriptions that differ by a global phase shift are not two realities. They are the same sentence written in different handwriting. We learned that gauge invariance is not a beautiful symmetry discovered late. It is a necessity of public knowledge. If a statement changes under an arbitrary global shift that no instrument can detect, it cannot be a public statement. This was the moment the listener began to feel the program as a compiler, a system that does not merely describe, but restricts, and by restricting, makes reality speakable. Episode 9 introduced grammar as admissibility. Once you have an infinite vocabulary, you can generate endless claims. That is dangerous. Episode 9 taught the listener that a universe is not built by saying everything. A universe is built by restricting what can be said without contradiction and by forcing every permitted sentence to carry a falsifier. Admissibility gates were installed. Window discipline, gauge discipline, finite jet sufficiency, and equivalence under canonicalization. This is where the program took its most severe stance. If a claim cannot be bounded, cannot be tested, cannot be made invariant, it is not deep. It is noise dressed as inevitability. Episode 10 confronted the danger of success. If a framework can measure, simulate, and intervene, it can also deceive itself at unprecedented scale. So engineering arrived with ethics embedded as technical constraints: uncertainty honesty, safe comparison, placebo resistance, counter-world controls, and the refusal to let power outrun auditability. At the end of episode 10, Holophase was not a story. It was a capability stack. And once power becomes real, an immune system becomes non-negotiable. Episode 11 built that immune system. Metagrammar. Rules about how rules are allowed to exist. What counts as a sentence? What counts as an equivalence class? What counts as evidence? What counts as falsification? What counts as revision? The firewall was not an afterthought. It was the recognition that the greatest threat to truth is not ignorance. The greatest threat is narrative drift, the slow slide from operational claims into metaphysical comfort while still sounding technical. Episode 11 turned epistemic humility into a formal discipline, a way of stopping the mind from manufacturing certainty where the data does not license it. Episode 12 then performed a great weaving. It did not add new primitives. It rebuilt the whole program in the listener's mind as one living object. Phi to comparison, comparison to windows, windows to derivatives, derivatives to triunity readouts, readouts to higher towers, towers to topology, topology to integers, integers to stable identities, identities to meaning as compression, meaning to prediction, prediction to falsification, falsification to firewall. Nothing was dangling. Nothing was optional. The listener could finally feel that this was not a list of ideas, but a single constrained architecture, and that skipping a step would not merely be lazy, it would be logically destructive. And only then did episode 13a enter the silent ground. Undifferentiated phi. Before dynamics, before spacetime, before objects, before even differentiation. This was not emptiness. It was permission. The permission for distinction, the permission for logic, the permission for information, the permission for objectivity. Episode 13a made a claim so minimal that it is almost invisible. Before anything can be anything, it must be possible for it to be different from something else. Phi is not difference itself. Phi is the capacity for difference to be possible. That is why we called it pre-ontological. It is prior to exists, because even the predicate exists depends on a distinction between is and is not. Part after part in episode 13a tightened the firewall around that claim. Phi is not a particle. Phi is not energy. Phi is not a field living inside a pre-installed spacetime. Phi is not mind. Phi is not mathematics. Phi is not teleology. Phi is not an absolute value to be worshipped. Absolute phi is operationally mute. Only relations can be public. Even the question, does it exist, already uses phi, because it distinguishes is from is not. So phi is prior to existence questions. It is what makes existence a meaningful predicate. Episode 13a stripped the program to the last permission, and in doing so, it created the cleanest possible launching pad for everything that follows. By the end of episode 13a, we reached a pressure point that is both beautiful and dangerous. We had removed every smuggled primitive. We had refused every shortcut. We had arrived at the silent ground where every prerequisite for a readable universe is present and nothing else is granted for free. At that point, the most tempting move is to rush forward, to say, now we have phi, so let's build a universe. Let's jump directly into differentiated phi and start weaving cosmogenesis. But that would betray the entire journey. Because episode 13a gives permission, but it does not give syntax. It gives the silent ground, but it does not give the public language that lets us move from silence into structure without cheating. If we leap from undifferentiated phi straight to differentiation without first freezing the language, we will smuggle assumptions through the back door. We will accidentally import familiar physics under new names. We will confuse our own metaphors for derivations. We will lose the ability to say, in a precise way, what would count as a failure and where that failure occurred. We will have no way to separate true structure from pipeline artifacts. In short, we will turn the Holophase program into what it was designed to defeat, an inspiring story that cannot be audited. That is why episode 13b must exist in the form we have now chosen. Episode 13b is not a detour. Episode 13b is the missing foundation stone between permission and differentiation. It is the Holophase language made explicit and non-negotiable. It is not cosmology. It is not dynamics. It is not interpretation. It is the declaration of tokens and rules that we are allowed to use when we later speak about differentiation. Episode 13b answers the questions that make all later questions meaningful. What counts as a valid sentence in phi terms? What objects are publicly expressible? How local lift choices are handled when phi lives on a circle? How derivatives are defined on excise domains away from obstructions? How jets form the finite alphabet of local structure? How integrability is tested so we can separate true obstructions from pipeline errors? How topology forces integers through loop closure? How holonomy packages global memory without requiring local absolutes? And how equivalence, invariance, and canonicalization prevent the same structure from being mistaken for many different realities just because it is written in different forms. Think of it this way. If you walk into a dark room and someone says, "There is a chair," you cannot test that claim without at least 3 prior permissions. You must be able to distinguish chair from not chair, you must have a window of access to the room, and you must have a method of comparison that another person can repeat. If you cannot share the method, then you have not produced public knowledge. You have produced a private impression. The entire Holophase program is built on refusing to confuse private impressions with public structure. That is why the earliest episodes kept returning to windows, even when we were not using that word explicitly. A window is the simplest acknowledgement of finitude. You never have the whole of reality in your hands. You have a bounded access, a laboratory run, a telescope exposure, a pulse of data, a slice of time. If you do not declare your window, your claim has no boundaries. And the claim with no boundaries cannot be falsified because it can always retreat into the parts you did not specify. Holophase refuses that retreat. If a claim cannot tell you where it applies and what would break it, it is not a claim we are allowed to keep. Episode 1's restraint was already a window discipline in disguise. It said, "Do not pretend you can speak from nowhere. Do not pretend you can begin outside the world. Begin inside the licensed access. And begin with the minimal permission that makes any comparison meaningful." That is why primitive comparability mattered. You can build a palace of mathematics and still fail to build a public theory if your comparisons are undefined. Primitive comparability is the first permission for any shared statement, because it is what makes same and different legitimate moves in a public language. This is also why the cyclic nature of phi mattered so early. A circle is the simplest model of repeatability without absolute origin. If you stand under the sky and track a cycle, you can say the pattern returns. But the universe does not hand you a privileged 0 point. You can choose a reference, but your choice is not a cosmic fact. It is a bookkeeping decision. Phi as a cyclic order captured this discipline at the root. It permits stable relations and stable loops without granting an absolute phase that no instrument can certify. By episode 6, when we spoke of an infinite language with finite access, we were not indulging poetry. We were naming a constraint that every working scientist knows and every myth forgets. Reality has more structure than any finite experiment can capture, but finite experiments can still produce reliable sentences if those sentences are explicitly bounded. The language does not need to be exhausted to be useful. It needs to be disciplined. That is why jets mattered. Finite truncations of an infinite derivative vocabulary. They are the practical alphabet of structure for finite beings. Episode 7's operational meaning also came with a moral edge. If meaning is predictive compression, then a sentence that cannot improve prediction is not meaning, it is decoration. This is a harsh filter, but it is what prevents a beautiful theory from turning into a religion. It also prevents despair, because it says meaning is not a private feeling, it is a public performance. The ability to compress what you have seen into a structure that survives contact with what you will see next. Episode 8's insistence on equivalence and canonical forms was our way of saying that reality cannot depend on your handwriting. Two people can compute in different coordinate systems, choose different phase references, and use different patching strategies, and yet they must arrive at the same invariant content if they are describing the same structure. If they cannot, then something is wrong. Either they are measuring different things, or one pipeline is leaking assumptions. This is not pedantry. It is the condition of civilization-grade knowledge. Episode 9's admissibility gates were, in effect, a pre-law constitution. Before you infer dynamics, you must decide which kinds of statements you are even allowed to make about structure. Otherwise, you will overfit the universe, inventing patterns that exist only because your language was unconstrained. This is why we installed the principle of finite jet sufficiency. If a claim requires infinite derivative order to state or verify, it is not a public claim for finite beings. A universe may have infinite depth, but a public science cannot demand infinite access. This brings us to the delicacy of the transition we are making now. We promised the listener that after the silent ground, we would move into differentiated phi. That promise remains true. But the order is non-negotiable if we want to keep the firewall intact. Differentiated phi is not merely phi plus a derivative symbol. Differentiated phi is phi spoken in a public language that defines what derivative objects are, where they are defined, how they patch, and what makes them invariant. If we do not freeze that language first, then the listener cannot know what game is being played, and we cannot know whether we are cheating. Imagine trying to teach someone to read by jumping straight into novels. You can do it only by smuggling literacy. You silently assume the alphabet, the grammar, the punctuation, and the meaning of the marks. The person might enjoy the story, but they would not be able to audit it, reproduce it, or write their own. Holophase refuses to smuggle literacy. We reveal the alphabet before we write the novel. That is why episode 13b is the language. And this is also why we can say, without any embarrassment, that we already covered much of episode 13b's intuition in episodes 6 through 10. The listener has been learning the feel of the language. Jets as finite sentences, invariance as public content, topology as punctuation, and windows as the stage on which claims can exist. But feeling is not the same as specifying. Episode 13b is where we stop and specify. It is the moment we list the tokens, the transformations, the invariances, the excision rules, and the closure conditions. And we seal them so later parts cannot drift. Once that language is sealed, differentiation becomes possible in the strict sense. Differentiation is the procedure that turns cyclic comparisons into structural objects. Local lifts, derivative fields, jets, integrability checks, and topological invariants. It also becomes possible to do something essential for mapping the expressed universe we actually see. To stitch across many windows without assuming they are already one continuous story. You do not assume that the sky and the lab are measuring the same structure. You earn the unity of the universe by discovering recurrence, constancy, and invariance across windows. Notice how clean this remains. We are not naming electrons, we are not importing forces, we are not stating dynamics, we are extracting the skeleton. What structure is present, where it is smooth, where it breaks, which integer charges exist, which holonomy patterns recur, which ratios remain stable, which symmetries emerge as invariances of the extracted patterns, and where gaps remain because the window is silent. This is what it means to map the expressed universe without pretending to own it. So episode 13b is not a delay of differentiation. It is the foundation of differentiation. It is the moment we say, here is the language in which differentiated phi will be spoken. And that makes the next move sharper, not slower. Because once the listener holds the language, the listener can watch us differentiate. The listener can see what we are allowed to compute, what we are forbidden to assert, and what would count as a failure that forces revision. This is why the order matters. Episode 13a gave us the silent ground, the permission for distinction. Episode 13b gives us the public language, the token set and grammar of fee structure. Then, and only then, do we unveil the differentiation map, the procedural engine that extracts the universe skeleton from phi access inside windows. Only after the skeleton exists do we allow dynamics to animate it and cosmogenesis to tell the history. We promised you the next step. We did not promise you a shortcut. The program has been one long refusal to skip the step that makes the next step meaningful. That is what makes it rare. That is what makes it worth doing. And that is why, now, we pause for language before we speak the universe. Always peace be upon you.